Okay, we are rolling. Okay, so today we are going to examine. Oh, well, first of all, this is the fifth video in the apologetic series, and today we're going to talk about. Well, we're going to examine several different worldviews, and we're going to see if any of them match the um, do they match the God that we can discern from things like looking at the universe and using philosophy and other things, looking at the fine tuning design, as well as knowing that there is a objective morality that is grounded in a higher being. Can we look at some of these worldviews or any of these worldviews and do any of them match God? Do any of them give an accurate depiction of God? And of course, this is not a standalone video. I'm not arguing for the existence of God in this video because I've already done that. So this is just going to be, is there already a worldview or systematic that is presenting the God that we can find out, we can find, and I want to address something because I saw a comment and I can't remember the user's name, so I'm sorry I can't remember your name or your the name of your channel. But I know what you do. I know you do like video games and stuff, which is pretty cool. I actually consider doing that type of stuff for my YouTube channel, and maybe I will eventually do something like that, but probably not in a very long time. And you mentioned, did I want to do like a video call or something like that? And this is what I'll say about that is number one, if you were going to do it in sort of like a debate form, I'm just going to say that I probably would not be able to do that. And the reason is I'm just not very good at debates. I don't know what it is about them. I'm just not good at them. And it's not like necessarily a lack of preparation or anything like that. I'm just not very good at debating. And so that makes me be cautious of things like that, which I'm not I'm not saying that that's what you were talking about, but if that is what you're referring to, then I can't do that because, like I said, I'm not good at debating. But you mentioned that you have some questions and objections, so I would say about that, because I want to address, because it is important. I don't want to just dismiss it. Is in the, I can't remember if it was in the design video or the cosmological video, I did bring up some objections in the, I believe it is the cosmological video, on objections to the idea of a universe that came into being. In other words, a non-eternal universe, a finite universe. And I mentioned that there was the eternal universe theory and the oscillating universe theory. And I said that I don't think the eternal universe is accurate, meaning I don't think the universe has always existed. And so, some of the reasons for that is, philosophically speaking, that's I think, to the best of my ability to understand, and maybe I'm missing something. I'm not saying I'm the smartest guy on this, which I'll talk about that in a second, on how I'm probably not the best guy you would want to talk about this with, and I'll explain that in a second. But how a eternal universe, philosophically speaking, I think it has some real problems with it. Again, with the idea of an actual infinite. or concrete infinite, and the reason is if time is an actual infinite, then that's a difficult. I think that's a difficult position to hold. That time is infinite, which again, scientifically speaking, we know that time is not infinite. That time is finite. We know that there's actually a there is a smallest unit of time, and I think it's 10 to the minus 35, or maybe it's 10 to the minus 33, and it's a extremely, it's a number we can't really even wrap our mind around, but it is there. So scientifically speaking, I don't think time is infinite, and I don't think philosophically speaking we can say that time is infinite. Now, of course, an objection to that would be, well, don't you believe you're going to be in heaven forever, and you believe that's going to be infinitely long? So how can I say, time's not infinite now, but it will be infinite? And again, I think that's a misunderstanding of eternity. Eternity is not an infinite amount of time. Eternity is not being bound by the constraints of time, because time is a physical property. We know that time changes. An example here, I'll say this. There are two atomic clocks, and one is in Greenwich, England, and one is in Boulder, Colorado. And they get off, and the amount that they're off is like it's so slim, like it's such a tiny number, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's such a tiny number. And you say, well, which one's right? Is the one in England right, or is the one in American right? And the answer is they're both. They're both correct, but they're at a different elevation. So time is actually different at those elevations. And you can go from here and you can get into like quantum physics and stuff like that. And that's fine. Some of that, I'm going to be honest, is a little over my head. I try to understand it the best I can, but that's another thing. Sometimes skeptics will go to like quantum physics, and things like that to sort of combat maybe a theistic worldview. And the problem, I'm not saying there's necessarily problems with that, but the only thing I would say to that is that that's sort of like the fringe of science. And to have to go there, I just don't know that I would do that in that scenario. However, I actually don't think quantum theory and things like that, I don't think that poses a problem for a theistic worldview, especially some of the discoveries which have been fairly recent. Some of the ideas that our universe, both in large scale and also in smallness, so small things, that they're actually digitally defined. And again, this is some of the stuff that kind of goes over my head. But it's like it's been programmed, sort of. That's the only way I know how to put it. So, an example of this is, and maybe you've never heard of this, but if you take, let's say you had a line, and you cut the line in half and you throw some of it away, and then you still have, you would still have half of the line, right? Well, you would think that you could cut that in half, do it again, and you think you could do that forever or indefinitely. And even if you really couldn't do it because it got so small, you would think that conceptually you could still cut that in half, throw the other half away, and still have what you have. But it turns out that's not true. There's a point in which if you try to cut it, it will lose a property called locality. And that, of course, that's strange. It kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You know, how does that happen? How does that work? Well, again, they're still trying to discover all these things, and it's an interesting field. But I know that's not your field. Quantum theory is not. You said that yours is astrophysics, which that's interesting as well. But so yeah, so I gave two objections in the cosmological video: the eternal universe theory, or called the steady state theory, and the oscillating theory. And I talked about how I don't think philosophically they work because of the infinite problem. And as far as the oscillating theory goes, you know, the idea that the universe that now exists, when when it's time to end, it will like sort of go back into a singularity, and then it will start over. It's like a cycle, and it just goes on and on and on. And again, maybe that's true. But to me, even if you have an oscillating universe, you still don't get away. You know, to me, that's just another link in the chain. Oh, so there was another one of these before. Okay, well, that's fine. I mean, you know, who knows? I don't think that. I don't believe that. I'm just saying, believing that does not, I don't think, rule out, I don't think it rules out God. That's just my opinion. But getting to what I said about, I'm probably not the best person to, or let me say this. There are plenty of Christian YouTubers online that can articulate these things way better than I can. And they do apologetics, and they're doing it for a living, as far as I know. Like they're monetized on YouTube and stuff. Mike Winger, you just type in Mike Winger, and you might want to say apologetics or whatever. He is a great one. You may want to look at. My mind's going to blank. He's the only one I can think about right now. Wes Huff. You can probably look him up. He's another good one. Now, I will say about Wes Huff, he's more of a manuscript guy, which we're going to get to that. We're going to get to manuscripts and stuff. But I still think philosophically, he can defend himself as well. Or, you know, defend the Christian worldview. So he's one. Well, I'm not thinking. For some reason, I can't think of anybody. So Mike Winger, Wes Huff. Those are really the only two guys I can think about. Oh, you may want to look at Trinity Radio. You may want to look at them. They have a guy on there who is good at apologetics, and he's good at giving arguments for God, and talking about the cosmological and design arguments and stuff like that. And they're way better at articulating. So one of the reasons you may have an objection is maybe what you've heard has just not been articulated well, and it just hasn't been presented in a, clear, concise way. But those guys do. They articulate it. They do articulate it well. And again, that's not a big proof of anything. Being able to say something well and present something well doesn't prove the truthfulness of it. But I am saying that they're just better at articulating some of this stuff I'm just doing this really and again, I want people to watch this. I want people to use this as a resource that hopefully it's helpful. But it really was a friend of mine I wanted to do this for. And actually, I haven't talked to him in a while, so I don't even know if he's watching any of this stuff. But so to your point again about having objections, what I'm doing now is a part of a series. So what I would say is I encourage you to see the series to its end. And the last video that I'm going to do in this series is probably taking on the best objection to the idea of God. And I want to address that, and I'll address that in my last video, the last video I make in this series. So I just encourage you to watch the whole series, and maybe some of your objections will be answered throughout the series, and I hope they are. And again, and hey, I hope your channel works out. Hope you get a lot more subscribers, and I hope, you know, maybe that is something you want to do, like as your job, and I definitely hope that works out for you. You know, and who knows what's going to happen to this channel. I was kind of doing this just on the side for a hobby, but who knows? Maybe our channels will blow up. And you know, YouTube likes controversy, so you know, if I did do the you know, the video call thing, it potentially would get big because YouTube likes controversy and stuff like that. So, you know, who knows? So I would say that's not something I can do right now, but but I'll keep it in mind. I'll say that. I'll keep it in mind, and I'll think about it. So, yeah, I'll think about it. But again, I'm not good at debates. I'll say that. I'm not very good at that. But anyway, all that aside, so we can actually get into what this video is talking about, and it's already almost 20 minutes in, so I'm probably going to go through this. Let's see, I have a lot here. Okay, well, let's just start. I don't know, maybe I'll have to make this into 2 videos. Who knows? Okay, so if you look at the religions of the world, obviously people say there's like, I don't know, people say there's a lot of religions, but we can kind of boil them down to a handful, because a lot of the religions, there's like different schools of thought within the religion, but like fundamentally they're the same. But religions as a whole, like a broad spectrum of religions, they all have different pictures of God. Now, there are similarities between them, but they're superficial, but there are fundamental differences, and they all can't be reconciled. I know a lot of people have this sort of view of kind of it's all true, but I don't think you can really hold that, since fundamentally these religions disagree with each other. Like I just said, you know, some see that each religion sort of teaches a part of the truth about God, and you sort of got to blend them to sort of come up with the fullest picture. And the example that's given is sort of like, there's that story about there's this king who's got like some business going on in the castle, and there's like an elephant there, and then there's these blind wise men, and they all like touch the elephant, and there's like different parts, and they say like, oh, well, it feels like this, or it feels like that, or it's like this, or whatever. And the blind wise men, you know, they touch the trunk and the leg and the tusk, whatever, and then they're arguing and debating over what it's like, and the king comes in finally, and he says, you don't have the full picture. You know, you need to bring these ideas together to get the full picture. So the interesting thing is, each blind man was right. They were right in what they felt, but they didn't have the full picture. And some people say that the religions of the world are kind of like that. You got to take a piece from each one and kind of put them together to get the truth. But the problem is if we're the wise men and God is the elephant, then who's the king? Who's the person who's stepping back and can see the full picture? So we need somebody who could do that. So the view that this idea illustrates that there is no correct view of God actually shows the opposite. Because to make the claim that there's no correct view of God would themselves have to have a correct view of God, which is what they're denying. So it's a self-refuting argument. But we have good reasons to believe God exists, I think, and we have a partial list of the attributes of God. So we see that, and I'm going to go through a list of these, that God is necessary, powerful, transcendent, non-contingent, intelligent, and personal. He also has a moral will, a purpose for how we're to live. He's engaged with the world, and motive and actions of human beings matter to him. He's also unique. There's nothing like him, and there's nothing outside of him that he didn't create, and there's no other gods. There's just him. And so this is our criteria that we're going to look at these worldviews for. If we find the view that fits, then it's accurate. But if a view that denies any of these, it's either false or it's got to explain why there is a discrepancy there. So the first worldview or system, or whatever you want to call it, we're going to look at is atheism. And atheism is the claim that, well, there's different claims made by atheists, but the idea is that God doesn't exist, or if he does, we can't know anything about him. And the physical universe is what exists. And obviously, this doesn't fit the criteria. Atheism, I don't think, provides an adequate explanation for how the universe came into existence or the appearance of design or morality. Again, the ideas of actual infinites and macroevolution and relativism also don't provide any good explanations either. The only religion that could be consistent with an atheistic worldview is Buddhism, or at least some forms of Buddhism, because God is ultimately irrelevant to Buddhism. God is definitely not necessary, and even if a Buddhist believes God exists, it doesn't really change anything about Buddhism. So though the arguments for God are good and compelling, some intelligent people, very brilliant people, they just don't buy them. And an example of this is Isaac Asimov, who's an author. I believe he's a science fiction author. He says, the notion of an eternal universe introduces a great many difficulties, some of them apparently, at least in the present state of our scientific knowledge, insuperable. But scientists are not disturbed by difficulties. Those all make up the game. If all the difficulties were gone and all the questions answered, the game of science would be over. So his opinion is like, yeah, we don't know how the universe came to existence, and an eternal universe doesn't scientifically seem to be accurate. But if we knew all the answers, then we couldn't do science, which is weird to me because I thought science was meant to give you answers. But he's saying the point of science is you don't know things. But okay, that's fine. So I would also add that the claim, and again, different atheists express atheism differently, and I'm dealing mostly with what the old atheists say, because there's sort of a new atheism that's a little different, but dealing with the old atheism, that these old atheists said that there is no God. That's a statement. There is no God. But I would say that is self-refuting. Because if I say that God exists, all I'm saying is that among the things that exist, God is among those things. But to say that God doesn't exist is you're saying that out of everything that does exist, God is not among them. But I'm not sure how you could say that. Because to make that claim, you would have to have complete and exhaustive knowledge of everything. And to draw the point is, if you're saying God doesn't exist, but you admit you don't know everything, then it could be that whatever you don't know, that's where God is. So I would just keep that in mind. And of course, the only person who would have complete and exhaustive knowledge of everything would be God. But however, some atheists don't say God doesn't exist. They just say that, God may exist or he may not, but if he does, we can't know anything about him. And this is called strong agnosticism. The idea that God may exist, but we can't know anything about him. But how did they get that information about God? Because they'd have to know everything to say that something is unknowable. So they do know something about God. They know that he's unknowable. Well, then that's knowledge of God. See, that doesn't work either. And because atheism corresponds to none of the attributes of God, then I think it can be rejected as a worldview. However, I would like to mention there are several atheists, and I'm just going to mention a few of them. Sigmund Freud, who I'm becoming to believe that he was actually evil. Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, Francis Crick, Woody Allen, Ayn Rand, Frank Zappa, and Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Are all some notable atheists, if anybody is interested in stuff like that, because I don't know, I kind of am. It's kind of cool to know what other people's worldviews are. But then we get to agnosticism, and I'll just kind of go through this pretty fast. It means to have agnosticism. The word means no knowledge. So you're saying you don't have knowledge. So this just means that it's unknown, not necessarily unknowable. So agnosticism is neither for nor against the claim that God exists. So this is not really a view, but it's a description of someone's current state of lack of knowledge or just an indecision. But agnosticism doesn't either. It doesn't meet the criteria either. And something I've thought about agnosticism, I thought about this, and I was like, so, when you're in school and you're taking a test or a quiz or whatever, and the teacher would say, or at least a lot of the teachers that I had would say, if you don't know the right answer, at least make an answer. Like, put something down. If you got multiple choice questions and you don't know if it's A, B, C, still mark one of those because you could get it right. And I'm not saying we should throw caution to the wind and not use critical thinking and things like that, but I'll get to, that's sort of like Pascal's wager, which is so misunderstood by both skeptics and Christians. Neither seem to understand what Pascal's wager is really about. But anyway, I guess that's sort of in that same vein. So atheism, agnosticism are out. Then we get to pantheism. And this is the view that everything that exists is ultimately God. Now, there's different forms of pantheism. Not everybody agrees. There's not like a central view of this. Some say that God is sort of like a force, kind of like in Star Wars or whatever, or God is sort of the totality of everything, or that God maybe manifests in many forms, but each are part of like an ultimate reality. And in Hinduism, there's like 330 million gods or whatever. Many pantheists, though not all, believe nature is a part of that whole. Other pantheists believe that material reality is just an illusion. But in either of these, God is impersonal. So that would go against what we know about God. Another thing in pantheism is that we are a part of God. And when we die, we are sort of like absorbed into the impersonal whole. And in pantheism, dualities do not exist. So things either are, or things in reality either are or are not real, or they're illusory. But in pantheism, there is no right or wrong or true or false, and God has no moral will. And whatever is, and it's kind of hard to say it, but whatever it is, and reality is the true reality, and everything else is just an illusion. So some gods in Hinduism, they're both benevolent and malevolent. So they both do good things and bad things. And also in pantheism, logic and reason are also illusory, at least in many forms of pantheism. And pantheism obviously does not meet the criteria because in pantheism, God is not intelligent because he's not a person. He's not engaged because he's not a person. He's not transcendent. And in pantheism, the universe is eternal and unchanging. And of course, this would require an actual infinite, which we don't find in the universe. This form of pantheism, which is based on the observation that the same matter and energy that makes the universe also makes us. So we're made by the universe, we're sustained by the universe, we're destroyed by the universe, and we're returned to the universe. So the universe is all that exists. And this brings out like awe and reverence and humility are given to the universe. And this is called scientific pantheism. So but the difference between scientific pantheism and other forms of pantheism is scientific pantheism does not deny dualities, and it relies on logic and reason. So there's a difference between the two. But again, it doesn't neither of these meet the criteria. Pantheism are featured in Hinduism, Taoism, some forms of Buddhism, New Age, paganism, some Unitarian Universalist, Christian Science, and Scientology. And Stephen Hawking and Carl Sagan and people like Albert Einstein, those could be considered like scientific pantheists. However, a notable pantheist was Henry David Thoreau, which I didn't know that, but he apparently was a pantheist. But pantheism has problems, and one of the problems is morality. If we're all absorbed into an impersonal whole, then we all share the same fate. So how we live ultimately makes no difference. So there's no really grounding for morality on pantheism. So like Mother Teresa and Hitler, or maybe or whoever, fill in the blank. These people, they go to the same place. It doesn't matter. But this is pretty counterintuitive, and it's pretty ineffective for a foundation of morality. One of the claims of pantheism is that we all are a part of God, and that that also God is unchanging. But if we come to realize that we're a part of God, then we have changed, which means that God has changed. In pantheism, there claims no logic or reason. But the problem is logic and reason are used to come to that conclusion. So it's self-refuting. Again, so pantheism, it doesn't meet the criteria that we have. And maybe in the video at some point, I'll maybe put the screen up on what the criteria is, so you can see it. But then now we're going to talk about panentheism. So this is not pantheism, panentheism, which sees God as both distinct and dependent on the world. So God comes from the world, but the world comes from God. And God is sort of this ultimate reality. And we're all a part of God, though we are not God, but we are a part of God. And because the world is changing, God is changing. And as we learn and grow, God becomes more powerful. and God learns and grows as we do. And God is seen as sort of like both the tree and the seed. The tree is what he could become, but the seed is what he is. But in pantheism, God actually never attains everything. And this is called process theology. God is always in a process. In pantheism, the universe or God, or however you want to put it, is all that exists and all that will exist. Yet, God is always changing and finite, and he's temporal. God is eternal, yet he's also both bound by time and finite. Now, this view wasn't really fully articulated until the 20th century. The ideas of it can actually be traced back to Plato and Socrates. Some forms of this are actually in Judaism and Christianity. There were some Latin American rebels in the 1960s who sort of mixed pantheism and Marxism and Roman Catholicism to create what's known as liberation theology, which is not important to really get into what that is. Main point is pantheism, it doesn't fit the criteria because it would require actual infinite. There's no grounding for morality. If God is ever changing, then moral values also change and they become fluid, and so that they lose their authority to enforce morality. And then up next is finite Godism, which I didn't know what that was until I started looking into this. But it describes God as the first cause. That is personal. God is loving. God is good. So that's points in favor of this. But since evil exists, then God can't, he's not in control of everything, or at least he's not able to eradicate evil. So in this view, God is not all-powerful and he's limited in his nature. God, it's not that God likes evil. God doesn't like evil, but he can't prevent it on this view. So they observe that there's imperfections, and so they reason from that there must be an imperfect God. Most people who hold this view don't believe in miracles either. But since God is finite, then there's no real certainty in God's ability to ground morality. So ultimately, the source of morality is unknown, although some in this view do see God as the source for morality. Some expressions of Reformed Judaism hold this, but it's not expressly taught in any religion that I could find. Now, you do have Zoroastrianism that teaches there's a duality of gods. There's one good and there's one evil, but they're both self-existent, and they created different things, and they're both finite. Rabbi Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, is sort of an articulation of finite godism. And oddly enough, Freddie Mercury was a Zoroastrian, and I did not know that, but I found that out. But finite godism does not meet the criteria, because if God is finite, where did God come from? And if God doesn't perform miracles, how did he create the universe, since that would have been of itself a miracle? If God is not the source of morality, then why does it matter what we do? If God is the source of morality, then it has limited force, since God is finite and may or may not be able to answer any wrongdoing with justice. And what if God is defeated by the bad God? Then God's not a necessary being, because things would be able to exist without him. So a God who isn't necessary isn't God. So yeah, so this is not accurate either. Then we get to polytheism. So polytheism is the view that there are many gods. And they either come from nature, or they were once man and sort of were like elevated to godhood. These gods are contingent, and they're also finite. In this view, the universe is eternal, or at least it was made from eternal matter. However, there's really no consensus in polytheism, but many are moral relativists, and They do not believe that morality comes from the gods. The polytheism is included in some Hinduism and Mahayana Buddhism, Confucianism. Wait, hold on. I got to get this right. Confucianism. There we go. Taoism, Shintoism, paganism, and Mormonism. I know that's a shock, but yes, Mormonism is a polytheistic religion. Now, Mormons, and if you're a Mormon watching this, hey, glad you're watching. But Mormons would object to calling Mormonism polytheistic because they say, well, we only worship one God, so we're monotheist. Well, no, and I encourage you, if you are a Mormon and you've never heard that Mormonism is polytheistic, read Joseph Smith, I believe it's called the King Follett Sermon. Read that. Also read The Pearl of Great Price and the Doctrine of Covenants. You're not going to find any of this in the Book of Mormon, but you will find the theology of Mormonism in those works. So just read those, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's all there. But it is true. Mormons do only worship one God. But in Mormonism, there's actually millions of gods who were once people and became gods. And, there's an infinite regression. We'll get to that in a second. But the worship of one God while believing in many gods is called henotheism. So you believe there are many gods, but you only worship one. I know Egypt. There was a time in Egypt where the Egyptians did that. They tried that out for a little bit. And George Harrison and Joseph Smith Jr. are notable polytheists. But polytheism, it doesn't fit the criteria. Because polytheists say that the universe or that matter always existed. But again, that's not possible because of the actual infinite problem. And Joseph Smith did say that matter is eternal. He did say that. In Mormonism, it requires God coming from other gods, but this doesn't account for the present state of gods because there's no first cause. And aside from actual infinites, it still has problems. It cannot account for the universe because there's no transcendent being. God is not transcendent. He also has limited power. He's not all powerful in polytheism, or they are not all powerful, I guess I should say. So yeah, no polytheism. There's not multiple gods for sure. And I always thought, people believed in multiple gods. Again, in polytheism, the gods are finite because if he is all that we believe he is, then there can only be one, and I'll get to that in a second. But then we get to deism. Now, deism holds that God can't be known through religion, but he's known through reason and nature. In deism, God is necessary, he's personal, he's powerful, he's transcendent, but the world, nature, is his only revelation. In deism, there are no miracles. The idea is that God sort of wound up the world and he's watching it run down and he's not interacting in any way. Now, deism is not really taught in any religion. There's no religion I can find that actually holds to deism. But it is held by several individuals who were prominent. Voltaire was a deist. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson were all deists. Thomas Jefferson actually edited the New Testament to take all the miraculous portions out of the New Testament, and he just had the ethical and moral teachings of Jesus. And I'm pretty sure that's what it was called. I think it was called like the Morals and Ethics of Jesus or something like that. It's known as the Jefferson Bible to us, but he called it something else. And as we can see, this is very close. This comes close. But the problem is that deism requires what it denies, namely miracles, or at least one. There must have been at least one miracle, because the creation of the universe was not a natural act. It requires miracles by a or at least one by a transcendent, all-powerful being. If you didn't have this, there wouldn't be any universe. And if the world could exist without God, he would not be all-powerful, since he couldn't stop it, and he's not necessary, and he wouldn't be a necessary being, and he would have no moral authority, since he doesn't have a purpose for what he did not create. So deism, although it's close, it fails to account for everything. Then we get to monotheism. And monotheism, the idea is that God created all things, he sustains all things, but that he's different from those things. God interacts with the creation in ways to reveal himself to us through morality, nature, reason, and direct revelation. So, in other words, in monotheism, you have to have some sort of revelation of God to understand him in his fullness. And there's really only 3 religions I could find, or that I can think of, that have this. And it's Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So either of these 3 would fit the criteria of God that we have now. So monotheism, it best fits what we know about God. But which religion is correct? Which religion is right? The difficult thing about this is these religions all claim to be talking about the same God. So the God revealed in the Old Testament is claimed by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. They all claim to be worshiping the same God. However, the Muslims claim that the Old Testament has been corrupted. So that's why Jews and Muslims are different. Christians believe that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament. So Jesus comes and fulfills the Old Testament. But Judaism denies both. They deny that the Old Testament has been corrupted, and they deny that Jesus is the Messiah, the promised Messiah in the Old Testament scriptures. And all these religions claim something about Jesus. Islam claims that he's a great prophet, but that the gospel accounts were corrupted, so they don't show the real Jesus. In other words, in our Bibles that you just pick up, from the store or whatever, they have an inaccurate view of Jesus because they've been corrupted. Now in Judaism, most Jews that are religious believe that Jesus was a pretender. He was a fake. He was a fraud. But Christians say that he is the Messiah. He's the Savior. He's the one that's come to fulfill the plan of God. To sort of see this through, we have to look at the authenticity and the trustworthiness of the New Testament. If the New Testament is trustworthy and it's authentic, then Islam can be discounted because it contradicts the New Testament. Then we can look at the Tanakh, which is what the Jews call the Old Testament, and see if that has been changed and if that is trustworthy. Also, if the Old Testament is trustworthy, what does it say about the Messiah? And if the answers don't correspond to what we know about Christianity, then Christianity either can't be accepted or it's got to explain why there's a discrepancy. And if it couldn't, we could embrace Judaism. But if the Old Testament corresponds to Jesus, we can discount Judaism, or at least Judaism's view of Jesus. So that's the next type of stuff we're going to get into. We're going to get into the New Testament. I'm going to make, I don't know how many videos I'm going to make on that. Maybe 1 or 2, maybe 2. I'll just have to see, because it may be too much to do in one video. So I think I might break it up into 2 videos. So yeah. So I hope that was helpful in looking at all these reviews. I always think that this stuff is interesting. If you want more of of this type of stuff, you may want to look into the work of a man named Walter Martin. He's passed away now, but he's done a lot of stuff in sort of in comparative religions. So you may want to look at some of his work. Again, he can articulate a lot of this stuff better than I can. But he's got a lot of books on that. And if you're a Mormon, or if you're a Christian and maybe you know some Mormons, there's a book by James White. And I have not read this, but I know it's trustworthy, and I know I can recommend it. I believe it's called, I'm blanking on the name, but I believe it's called Are Mormons Brothers, or something like that. But you can probably just look up James White, book on Mormons or whatever, and you'll be able to find it. And that's talking about, basically, are Christianity and Mormonism compatible? Are they the same? And they're not. So we're gonna get into the New Testament, and who wrote the New Testament, and is the New Testament, is it just copies of copies of copies of copies? Was the New Testament written, here, and 500 years later, is when we find the first copy or whatever? Is that how it is? And it's not. If you think that, then you're not caught up in the most recent scholarship on this stuff. And when it comes to scholarship, I actually disagree with some of even the majority opinions on some of the stuff. Not necessarily in their conclusions, but we'll get into that. We'll get into like dating the Gospels. A lot of people say they were written much, much later. Some people say that they were even written, maybe 100 years after Jesus was crucified. So how can we even know, what Jesus really said or what he really did? We don't know any of this stuff. And I'm going to totally blow that out the water, because that's totally false. And even if you had a later date for the Gospels, which most scholars do, by the way, I'm going to push back on that in one of those videos. But even if you did, it's still within the generation that would have known Jesus, and if something was wrong, they could have corrected it. So yeah, but anyway, we're gonna get to that at some point. So yeah, so I hope everyone has a good rest of their day, and the weekend's coming up, so that's always good. And so yeah, so I will see everybody later, and God bless.